My name is Peter Young. I'm CEO and Managing Director of Young Partners. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Young Partners Forum on how to build an effective sales force. I'm particularly pleased to be moderating and having as our speaker Adam Woodrow, who I've known for a few years, right, Adam?
Yep.
Pleasure to know him both as a friend, but also working with him and his colleagues at Paratek as they built the company and successfully were able to get a number of things approved by the FDA and obviously then go on to commercialize their products. I think when Adam is, I think, particularly well suited for this topic for a number of reasons. One is he's had an extraordinary career and very successful one in many different roles, working for not only some large household names, whether it's Bayer or Pfizer, et cetera, but also for new companies such as Paratek. And I think that's a very important thing because this world really has a real mix of people and different companies and different strategies. And having someone who had experience, over the years, but also in different settings, is very important. I like to tease Adam that he has one of these accents and voices that no matter what he says, it sounds fantastic, and it always is fantastic. But he's sort of like the guy who played Darth Vader in Star Wars. No matter what he said, you knew it was serious, right? So that's a plus. But he spent before he became, he's currently the president and chief commercial officer of Paratek Pharmaceutical, which was a private company. Now, excuse me, was a private company, and then public, and then private. And he was the chief commercial officer up until 2019. He had a career at Pfizer for 5 years before that in various strategic and operational commercial roles. And while he was at Pfizer, he led the commercial development in the Pfizer Specialty Care business unit and launched a whole variety of drugs, and also led the strategic marketing teams for a variety of products. Before that, he was at Wyeth, and before that, so at Bayer. So he's had a breadth of experience. So what I'd like to do is really divide this, this webcast into three parts. I think the first one is really to talk about the big picture and really say, I want to really ask Adam what his perspective is on all of the recent developments, but also the long-term strategic and structural developments that have occurred in the biopharma industry. Because I think it's very important to have a big picture view, but also it's very important to have understanding of history and how things have evolved. We've had an extraordinary number of major developments in the last 6 weeks or so, but I really like Adam to go back farther back in his career and really comment on how the structure of the industry has changed, and therefore how strategies and and operational things have changed. So Adam, you want to reflect on the history of the structural change in the industry and what some of the lessons are for those of us following the industry or in the industry today.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for inviting me to come in and share my views. I think I'll start actually on an area that perhaps is not one that gets much notice, but is very important, and it's actually to do with the development side of the business, and that is the approach that the FDA has taken over the years. I was fortunate enough to start my career in at least in the marketing side of the business, on blood products. So I was working in the area of hemophilia, just as we were launching the sort of very early monoclonal antibodies. And at about that time, we started to see that the FDA, in particular, was starting to become a little bit more strict in the way that they approached approvals of drugs. In particular, they started to focus on manufacturing processes. And of course, in those early days, they were very much focused on the highest level of risk, and then they've worked their way down. And over the years, we've seen that they've gone through, starting with the blood products, which is where I was at that time. I then had the misfortune to move into just injectables, and that was the next area that they focused on.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, it's gone on to pills and now food. And what they've done here is they've no longer accepted the manufacturer's comments about improvements that they will make. They actually want you to see you make them.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I've lost count now, certainly in the last decade or so, the number of drugs I've seen manufactured by small companies that don't meet muster for approval. And it's interesting when you look at the number of drugs that actually fail to gain approval. There's as many that are failing because of manufacturing issues as there are because they failed their primary endpoints in their clinical trials. They rarely fail if they, in the past, if they made their primary endpoint, the FDA was often willing to accept manufacturing deficiencies. But nowadays, there's no truck with them. They will not allow products to go through if they don't feel comfortable with the manufacturing processes. That, of course, is an area that smaller companies often take shortcuts in because they don't necessarily see the value of it. But if you've not done it right early on, that can set the development program back 4 years. And too many small companies come unstuck when that happens because they think that their drugs are ultimately going to be picked up by a big company. And in fact, their manufacturing process is not up to snuff, and that actually stops the deal.
Yeah,
Yep.
and in fact, even investors sometimes they don't pay enough attention.
Investors in particular don't pay enough attention to that.
They get excited about the technology, the drug development, and so even some of the more sophisticated private investor venture folks, they get misled because they don't focus enough on CMC and manufacturing.
Absolutely. Now I'll take it one step further because I'll bring it up to date. Because nowadays, at least here in the United States, we're looking for more of a secure supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So it used to be you'd look for the lowest cost manufacturing site, which invariably often was Asia and
Mm-hmm.
India. Now I would caution against that, especially dependent on the drug, but I would definitely caution individuals to think about building all their manufacturing in those areas. As there's quite clearly a push on both sides of the house to be a little bit more homegrown when it comes to especially essential medicines. If your product is going to be one that potentially the government's going to want to purchase in large volumes, they never want to be held hostage to a foreign entity unless it's a friendly foreign entity. And so that's a recent development that's occurred. But again, it's around that manufacturing and CMC space. So an area that investors don't necessarily take a lot of notice of. Small companies sometimes take shortcuts, but increasingly is becoming one that's got more and more focus. If it didn't have so already from an FDA approvability perspective, even where it's made nowadays is coming under increased scrutiny. So that's one of the first sort of macro things that I think is a trend I've seen and something that needs to be taken into account. The next thing I think of from a macro perspective is just generally the order of importance at a physician level. So I'm going from pre-approved manufacturing drugs to the coalface, which is when you're selling, and we'll talk about building field forces a bit later on. But one of the things that for many years, because I've been in the industry well over 35, I think I'm in my 36th, 37th year now, and I've spent a lot of that time in the sales and marketing organization, and have done lots and lots of market research over the years. And for the first probably 20 or so years, you already knew what the order of hierarchy was going to be for the attractiveness of your product, and you measured it against certain elements, and you would look for differentiation in one of 4 factors. And the 4 factors were efficacy, safety, tolerability, and cost. There was always efficacy normally always came out on top because it trumped safety. Because if doctors will be willing to forgive quite a bit if you've got a really efficacious drug in an area that's got some unmet medical need. But it was that sort of order of hierarchy. It would be efficacy, safety, tolerability, and cost. And then about 10, 15 years ago, I started to see a change, which was firmly embedded and now exists every time you do this research. And there's a new factor that's just come out of absolutely nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the ability to pay.
Yeah.
And the ability to pay is now the number one factor when deciding which drug to put a patient on from a physician's perspective.
Yeah.
An enormous change. We're not talking cost here, just the ability to pay. What's their insurance? What does that insurance cover? Am I likely to be able to get that through? How much hassle is it going to be to get this product to this patient, even if I do believe it's the right thing for them? And that now has changed, and that sort of access factor is now an incredibly important thing that you need to take account of. And it needs to be taken into account even before you start thinking about your phase 3. You should already know how you're going to distribute, where it's going to go, what's your likely pricing going to be, how are you going to negotiate with the payers, because that ability to pay is the number one factor that has to be overcome before you even get into the argument around how efficacious, safe, tolerable, and what the cost is. So that's something that I've seen change, but it's, I believe, now firmly embedded.
Yeah, and actually, your favorite topic, which is the changing the rise of PBMs and their role. I mean, that if 30 years ago is quite different than it has been over the last 20 or so years, right?
Yeah, you've basically got three major PBMs
Mm-hmm.
that control access to drugs. I mean, I've been fortunate enough. I mean, obviously, in the last 10 years, I've been focused on one product, and Paratek. I joined Paratek 5 years before we launched Nuzyra. But you know, prior to that, I was part of a couple of major launches, one in the rheumatology space, an area I know well, having managed Enbrel for the best part of 7 or 8 years. We launched Xeljanz and a rare disease drug called Vyndaqel for TTR-FAP. And, you know, it's interesting when you think about where we were, but it was absolutely clear even then when we were launching our rheumatoid drug, that the payers had a tremendous amount of control. The rebates that they were getting were so significant that even with a highly efficacious drug in a space where they're already getting enormous rebates from incumbents, in this case it was Enbrel and Humira, the new products on the block get blocked out.
Yeah.
Because the loss of revenue for the PBMs is such that they're not willing to allow a product to come in ahead of them. They want you to step through these drugs before you actually get to one that's going to, in essence, lose them money, because they're
and it's a bit sad because the whole original logic of PBMs was quite different. You know, the
very much so.
Whole idea was they were supposed to save money because they could, you know, manage the process and in the end, you know, save money in terms of drugs for the consumer and so forth. But it hasn't worked out that way.
No, it's not worked out that way, and I think it's generally understood, at least in the pharmaceutical industry, if not everywhere, that the whole PBM model tends to escalate the price of products because the companies tend to take into account the enormous rebates they need to pay them to get access. I've also seen a couple of things that have occurred over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's related to this topic. And that is, for a while, there were 2 approaches to bringing new products to market. One was to, in essence, rebate significantly to get extremely good access,
Mm-hmm.
to enable you to grease the skids, for want of a better word, to for the physicians, so that they didn't have any problems getting access to your product. Unfortunately, I just don't think that model works nowadays, because the other model, of course, is that you haggle intensely over a period of a year or two to not necessarily give as large a rebate. accepting the fact that your volume will be a bit lower. But what I'm actually seeing in the marketplace, especially having evaluated a number of drugs recently, is those that have gone down the high rebate model, getting what is clearly rapid access. The problem has been that they've not been able to scale it back.
Yeah.
And that's always been the theory, is high rebates, scale it back, and once it's established, and then take those rebates out. That's not working. And the reason for that is that the controls are so strong now, the volume's not coming with it. And so anyone who's thinking of going down that route has to really be sure that they're going to get the appropriate volume, and that there will be an opportunity to take those things away. Otherwise, I would advise everybody nowadays to think more in terms of come in a little bit higher, take some time over the negotiations, because I don't see a new drug coming into the retail space in the United States ever again.
Really?
And that's a pretty strong statement, but
that's pretty strong. Yeah.
And the reason I say this is because the PBMs will put a control on and a prior authorization unless you can match a generic price.
Right.
And nobody has got the volume in a new market to match a generic.
Right.
So you're going to get a prior authorization. Even if you charge $50 for your product,
right,
you're likely to be 10 times the cost of the generic.
Right.
So you've got the PBMs that you have to negotiate with, who, as I've mentioned before, expect large rebates for products that are coming to market, because that's their business model. And then you have underneath those all these regional plans who have 100% generic formulary, and they've got very little opportunity to even get onto their plans, because they're all running 100% generic formularies. They have no space for a branded agent, just like the retail. The retail market has no time to be able to be dealing with prior authorizations or step edits or any of these things. And as a consequence, they don't want, if you talk to Walgreens or CVS on the retail side, they don't want to deal with branded products. They really don't.
Yeah. By the way, if we step back even a bigger picture, first of all, obviously, biotechs didn't exist up until a certain point in time. It was really big chemical companies that had a pharmaceutical arm. And then the whole method for making pharmaceuticals shifted from just chemical to a different method. So gradually, the technology for R&D changed. But then you also had biotechs develop. And for a long time, the relationship between big pharma and the biotechs was pretty simple. The biotechs didn't feel that they would be able to build their own sales force. And also they depended a lot on big pharma sometimes to get through the regulatory process. So you had a lot of that which either sold out or they would do partnerships and so forth. But that gradually changed. The biotechs developed more and more expertise themselves to do certain things, regulatory. You had orphan drugs, which obviously the ability to get your product in the hands, if it's 5 research centers, you don't need a Pfizer in order to get to those 5. So the relationship, changed, right? Now it keeps changing again, right? Because of the change in, in the industry. You went through that. Just walk through your thinking. I remember when we were chatting when you were deciding how to roll out the Salesforce at Paratek. And a lot of these things were things you had to take into account. Where were the customers? Who were the prescribers? Was it going to be the hospital based or this or that? Sort of walk through kind of the big picture strategic things that drove the decision in the end. I remember you were debating, should we have a share the bag, all those kinds of things you were debating at the time.
So there's a couple of considerations. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is, and I totally agree with you, the market dynamics have changed. The focus is more and more on specialty drugs, even for the big companies, and you can see that the massive push to get into oncology that has occurred over the years. And let's face it, there's something like 3,000 rare diseases in oncology. It's just as easy for a small company to go into that space. They don't need armies of field forces anymore. There's a lot fewer drugs that are in the primary care space, that's for sure. And And I suppose the other thing that I would say, at least from my perspective, because I was there, is, you know, the idea that you're going to build a company to be sold is not a good idea.
Yeah.
You have to have the ability and the credibility to say, you know what, if we don't get a proper price for this, we're going to do it ourselves. Now, Paratek went through that. We went through that. We never we were never sure whether anyone would be interested in the anti-infective space. As it turns out, our strategic thinking turned out to be correct, which was let's be prepared to launch. The way we went about our launch was a little bit different than perhaps most, and that was one where we built slowly. A lot of companies have a tendency to say, "Hey, this is what it's going to take." They in essence build an army of a field force, or everything that they believe they need. They go off, they do an analysis, they work with ZS or Trinity or one of these large players who come back and say you need 220 representatives, or you need 70 representatives, and they immediately recruit all those people and off they go. And then 6 months in, they realize that actually the players have slowed things down a little bit more than they were expecting, and immediately reduce their field force, which immediately demoralizes everyone because they're basically running out of cash.
Yeah, because Salesforce chews up a lot of cash, right?
Oh my word, absolutely. And I still to this day remember speaking to my chairman at the time and telling him after we just raised $300 million that we might well need another $300 million to get to profitability from a field force perspective. And his jaw hit the deck, and he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." And I explained it and I showed him. Now, as it happens, that's partially to do with the fact that antibiotics have a very slow ramp.
Yeah.
But you know what, even other drugs, I've seen many other drugs that are not antibiotics that have also had a slower than expected ramp, but a much bigger field force than they should have probably started with. And you know, one of the things that you could do, and certainly the thing that we did, was we picked our top 30 potential territories.
Yeah.
And instead of coming out with the 60 or 70 representatives that had been recommended for us, we came out with about a half of that. We tested it with the 30 that we had. We saw success, and then we gradually expanded over time. We also knew that the primary care setting was an opportunity for us, because our first foray was to garner acceptability and utilization and trial in the specialty market for an antibiotic that, of course, is infectious disease consultants. But we know for the indications that we have, there's a large untapped market in the community setting. We didn't even approach that for 2 years. And then when we did, we started with 4 representatives. Can you imagine it? A 4-person primary care field force.
Yeah.
But it was really a pilot to see, could we get the return on investment? We had these 4 representatives in the field, and interestingly enough, it was actually during the back end of COVID, and they were profitable. We could see that they were going to reach profitability within about 12 months, which is not bad. And so we then expanded. And now we sit here and we have a pretty large primary care field force. We have a field force of about 50 or so in hospital, and 150 to 160 in the community market. But we took 5 years to get there.
Yeah.
And that conserves cash, but it also gives you the ability to put, you know, to be able to point to proof points as to why it's worth doing.
Yeah.
And you know, you mentioned earlier on, we were private, then we went public, and we've gone private again. And the reason we went private and we could find a private investor in us is they could see, based on our history, that if we were to expand, we would actually get to that critical mass that we needed. And that's duly what we've done. And we're really pleased with the outcome, because we doubled our field force last year, and we've shown that nothing has changed. We're still as profitable as we said we would be, and the new expansion territories have done exactly as we predicted.
But of course, Adam, you really miss all the paperwork of being a public company and having to talk to investors and so forth.
Oh, I absolutely miss that.
I think every day you wake up and say, "Boy, damn, I really miss all of that," right?
Yeah. Well, can you imagine, Peter? It's because I know this is being recorded, but we're sitting here. It's the 13th of March.
Yeah.
In 2025. Can you imagine trying to raise money in the market today
Oh, good. It'd be tough.
Not going to happen.
It wasn't it wasn't easy when you were raising money, right? It wasn't
No,
a
we were unfortunate. We launched, and within about 9 months or so, COVID hit, and you know, we had to launch, you know, within 9 months. We were just starting to find our feet, actually, and all of a sudden we were locked out of all of the institutions, and basically out of the doctor's offices. I still fondly remember a really nice guy that I was chatting to, who came from the anti-infective space, but he'd launched a number of drugs, and he said, "I've always wanted to launch a drug remotely." And I looked at him and I said, "If it was your only drug, would you really launch it remotely?" He said, "Oh, no, no." I said, "Well, neither am I. So nice idea, but I don't think I can do that." Well, what I find fascinating about the whole sort of COVID exercise is we actually, for the first time in history, had a really good example of what happens when you work 100% remotely, because every company went completely remote. We did it within two weeks, and I can tell you what happens. I've got all the data. I'm shocked and surprised that there hasn't even been a Harvard review, or McKinsey has not come out with an analysis of this. But
Well, Adam, there's room there for you to be part of a case study. I'll call the dean at Harvard Business School and say,
it's there.
Call Adam, right?
It's there, and I can tell you that on the macro level, you can still sell your product in a remote, 100% remote setting through telephone and through you know, WebEx meetings or Zoom or whatever it is you're using, but you actually get about a third of the patient and physician acquisition
Yeah,
that
right.
you do on a face-to-face basis, and that shows you the sheer power of face-to-face meetings by contrast to doing things completely remotely. You know, telephone, Zoom, WebEx, they're really good, but you don't get the level of commitment that you get when you're sitting in front of a physician. And so, you know, the days of the representative are still going to be around as long as there's access.
You know, it's really, Adam, your situation is one of the reasons why I wanted you to be the speaker today is the Paratek, and now you built a number of sales over time, and some were more traditional drugs that broad use and so forth. But with Paratek, the more recent one, what makes it somewhat unique and more of a challenge is you were sort of in between. In other words, it would have been real easy if you were an offered drug. You say, okay, there are 5 research centers. How do I reach them? So forth, so forth, so on. On the other hand, if you were broad-based drug, you know, as opposed to what you know, then it might have been different. So you had to make some tailored choices, I guess, right? And I think so. This slow build up that was a result of that strategic thinking and saying, well, where in this universe does this product fit, right? And within this system, right?
Yeah, I would say I'd love to tell you it was all strategic thinking, Peter, but it was actually as much necessity. You know, small companies don't have the luxury of the sort of levels of resource, and what I mean by that is money and people that you have when you're working for Pfizer or Wyeth, as you know, the last two big companies that I'd worked for. And so there was a necessity to conserve cash while still promoting our product and getting ourselves to a point where we could reach profitability. So that, having said all of that, there was always a decision that we were going to start in hospitals before we migrated into the community, and we always had the strategic intention to take our time with the payers, not to sell the farm to get access and accept a lack of access early, but without giving huge rebates, because it would just affect our profitability. And I'm still to this day convinced that in most cases, the volume you're going to get is not necessarily tied completely to the level of access. I can tell you now, especially as I've been assessing a number of drugs recently, our level of access is no different to some companies that have gross to nets that are truly detrimental to the health of the company, because they're losing 70% of their profitability because of the rebates and the method of distribution, as opposed to where we've been historically, which is in the 30s.
Yeah.
And their access is no different. They have the same number of lives covered as us.
Right.
They
Right.
have the same coverage. Our copay, of course, is no different. I mean, we do the same things that they do, only they've got less room to do generous copay because they don't make as much money. I assessed a product 2 years ago, only to realize that they were losing $5 on every script that they generated. I'm not even sure they knew at the time, but they certainly did by the end of the exercise, and that was because of the different channels they were using, and they were going down certain channels that were causing enormous harm to the company. Part of it is also the way that the representatives are incentivized, because they will take the path of least resistance, and so I've seen companies that have done consignment. I've never been a big fan of consignment,
Mm-hmm.
because ultimately the company is the primary payer.
Yeah.
Representatives know that they've got a backdrop of that. They actually promote to it. And before you know it, everything's going through consignment, and there's no incentive often for the pharmacist to even do a benefits investigation. And as a consequence, the product's going free to the patient, but it's costing you a fortune because you're in essence reimbursing the everyone involved, and before you know it, you're losing $300, $400, $500 on every prescription.
Now, Adam, let's say the assignment was to create kind of a tutorial, right, for people who are building Salesforce, so forth. And there are different criteria because there are a lot of choices. There are choices you could.
Yep.
When is it a case where you can go directly to the research center? When is it a case where you should build your own sales? So when is it true that you ought to team up with a Pfizer or whoever it is and so forth? If you were to pick the 5 or 6 key questions that will drive the decision one way or the other, what would those questions be that you would ask, the head of sales or marketing for a drug company to decide, who's not at a Pfizer, in other words, who's at a biotech or mid-sized pharma company?
So I think the first thing I'd be looking to think about is, who's my target audience? How many representatives do I need for optimal? And you have to also determine what is optimal for you, because the analysis that you can have done, there can be a profitability analysis. It could be a revenue analysis. I mean, we actually changed over time. Initially, we wanted revenue, and then later we went to profitability. But you have to make sure that when you are selling the drug, never ever sell it for a loss. That's really, really important. So in determining the representatives and whether you want to be building yourself, partnering, or outsourcing, because that's another thing. I mean, I actually outsourced my initial field force for the first 12 months. It was meant to be a 12-month contract, in case we needed to really cut significantly early on.
Oh, so you outsource, so you used a contract Salesforce, is that?
I used a contract Salesforce for the first 12 months. It ended up being 24 months because, of course, COVID was in there. But by the time we'd got through the first year of COVID, we realized we were still on track to be progressing towards profitability. And as a consequence, we brought all of those people on. We were going to do it at the end of 12 months, but that was exactly when COVID hit, and so we deferred that decision.
Right.
And the reason we did that again was one that at the time we didn't know. I mean, a lot of companies were expressing interest in potentially whether you're a company that could be better off in the hands of another company.
Yeah.
And so, do you want to bring on a massive, great big field force only to say, thanks very much, we've been taken over by another company 3 months later? We went down that sort of outsource route, but with the intention of bringing them on 12 months if nothing materialized. And that's exactly where we went, although it was deferred 12 months. When it comes to, rare disease drugs, things like that, I mean, given the numbers of people that are often required for these smaller, certainly the rare disease and the number of units, it's often the most economical way is to build your own field force.
Yeah.
But if you've got something that's on the macro scale, if it's your first drug, you may well consider outsourcing or partnership.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about, now that you have a Salesforce, it's running well and so forth, have you ever thought about reaching out to someone and say, hey, look, I'll sell, I'll lend you the, part of the use of my Salesforce, and we'll have kind of a sharing arrangement. Have you thought about that where
Oh yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, it really is not great for companies, including Paratek, to be promoting just one product.
Yeah.
We're lucky because we have a profitable drug, and we can and have reached profitability with one product. But the truth is that if I'd had my way, we would have actually partnered with a primary care company who would have done the primary care promotion for us. Now, the challenge I was faced with is that there really weren't that many primary care companies out there of the size that could do this. We had a drug that was profitable enough to do that. Many products, by the way, in primary care are not profitable enough to even share because they don't get the volume. And we don't get massive volumes, but we are profitable enough for a company to make money in a partnership deal. But it's really close.
Yeah.
It's really close. Having said all of that, of course, I'm now in the position where we're profitable, and we would benefit ourselves from being a partner to someone else that wants a promotion of a product in the community.
Right.
And that's actually something I can say, because it's part of our investment hypothesis. It is, we want to bring in new products and add other products to the bag of our community setting. We talk to podiatrists and primary care physicians and nurse practitioners, and not everyone's in the position to be able to promote that. If you've got a couple of indications, it's always easier to target hospitals. It's a smaller group of individuals, but once you go into primary care, it becomes a very large marketplace indeed, and there you should be really considering whether it's one of those spaces where you want to partner, at least initially, rather than go it yourself. I mean, and say we went there a couple of years afterwards after a pilot because we were unsuccessful in finding a partner.
And the reality is the economics, if you look at it, it's pretty straightforward. Costs the same amount for someone, the detail guy, to go out and sell if he has 3 drugs or 1 drug. But then you do have the trade-off. It doesn't come entirely for free, which is, how much attention will you get for your drug or your partner. So it's not an easy decision, right?
No, there's an opportunity cost because once you've got 2 products in the hand, one of those products, if it's a lot more profitable, it's definitely going to come down in terms of its overall revenue. But you obviously do that analysis and the calculation, and you work out, whether it's the right thing to do or whether it's not the right thing to do. And finding the right partner. The other thing, of course, is the magnitude of the overlap, which is the most important factor when considering bringing another product in. Is can you actually overlap, or do you overlap with the same call points? Because it's all around call points. If you're going to do 2 details, it's all right to say I'm going to do 2 details, but if it's 2 different doctors, there's only so many you can see in a day. But if you're seeing the same doctor, adding an extra 3 minutes on for another call
is worth thinking about.
That's worth doing. That's really worth doing.
Now, look, sort of looking forward, the good news and the bad news about the pharmaceutical industry is it keeps changing. It's good news because there's a lot of innovation, there's and so forth. There's a bad news also because some of the changes are not necessarily good, right? And so forth. What are the kind of structural changes? I mean, the classic thing is everybody says, okay, example, is AI going to affect your part of the business, for example, or whatever it is? What are the list of things that you see that are changing, whether it's technology or otherwise, or behavioral or structural, right? I mean, who knows? Well, there's one question, which is who knows with all of the change with the new, Trump administration, with also it's, people aren't really sure about all the changes that are going to happen over the next couple of years, right? But what are the changes that you see? Does AI affect? I mean, AI is being used very heavily in the drug development side, right? Very successfully. Not as clear the extent to which it would help on the sales side. And your thoughts on the changes that you see happening now and you expect to happen?
So there's a few things I think will continue. we have a lot of regulation in this business, as you're aware, but local state regulation trying to control and rein in prices is not going to go away. If there's one thing I've learned, we have a tremendous amount of what I consider to be local state reporting, and that's just going to continue to go up as more and more states jump on the bandwagon of requiring data on payments to physicians in their state, etc. That will continue. One thing that's extraordinarily frustrating, but one that I hope at some point might be addressed, is I mentioned the PBM. It all starts with PBMs in many cases.
Right.
You've got three major PBMs who are relentless, and what I mean by relentless is they ask you to sign a 4-year contract, and 3 months to 6 months later they come back and ask for a change and a modification, which includes, of course, an additional rebate. They
never lower their costs.
They never lower their costs.
I'm so shocked at them.
They always ask for more, but the thing that's most frustrating is you sign a 4-year contract and within a year you've re-signed a new one. And it's every single year. I keep asking my head of access, why am I signing a 4-year contract when I know in 12 months they're going to come back and ask us for another 4-year contract with another additional point for some service that we don't have any benefit of. It is relentless. It's not going to stop. Although there's a lot more focus on things that potentially are not in the patient's best interest. And so that's one area where I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we might see some change. And I don't think it matters which administration's in, because I think they've all become aware that it's not all bad pharma.
Yeah.
I would say that, pharma have not helped themselves. As someone who's led and been the head of sort of determining the price for a number of drugs, I do see pharma sometimes being a bit greedy. And what I mean by that is they've got genericization going on in their portfolio, and they have to make up a gap, and they see a forecast that comes in and a price, and they say, well, I've got a gap of $1 billion, let's just double the price, that'll work. It doesn't always do that, unfortunately, and then the drug flops. But the fact remains that there's a lot of space there to be explored, I think, via the administration in terms of how they're going to manage the PBMs. And in addition, they've highlighted a number of drugs that they want to focus on. I suspect, as is always the case, when they say it's only going to be a few, before you know it, all of them will come under the penalties that exist today. Even if you're not in the top 20 or top 50, you'll find that every drug that is sold to the government will come under a penalty. Now, what else do I see happening?
By the way, Adam, I'd be very happy to send you Elon Musk's email, and you might send me a little note just saying, "Dear Elon, I just have one word to send to you. PBM."
I'd be shocked if he hasn't already seen that from a dozen other people, Peter. I'd willingly.
You never know what he might do. You never know, right?
I would willingly lend my head of access to go down there and explain it, but unfortunately, there's a distrust when when pharmaceutical companies say it's all there. Unfortunately, rightly so, they say, well, it's not all of them, and it isn't always them. The pharma companies, we're as guilty as well. But I was about to mention something else then when you were mentioning this in terms of the payer side. But I think that aside from the PBMs causing some challenges, I don't see any changes in terms of the way that the FDA acts in terms of manufacturing. That's going to remain unforgiving and probably rightly so. That they'll only approve drugs that have got their manufacturing nailed down. But I do think, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, that where your product is manufactured is going to be as important as how it's manufactured, especially if it becomes an essential medicine. And getting back to that point about reimbursement, one of the things that you've seen already, which I find an interesting development, is around the GLPs.
Yeah.
The GLPs have got a great big market and a very large target audience. We've got what was it? The estimate is 40% of the United States is are overweight or obese. But what we're seeing there is that they're moving closer and closer to cash pay.
Yeah.
And that's a way of getting away from the PBMs. I mean, frankly, it's just, let's get away from this. Let's go down the cash pay route, which is all well and good, obviously, for the individuals that can afford to pay it. But unfortunately, not everyone can. And, you know, those that can will, because it will probably be a lot less hassle. And those that can't will have to run the gauntlet of these prior authorization processes. I mentioned that earlier on, that I don't think that there'll be a drug that's launched outside of the specialty arena in the future. And the reason I say that is that, you know, prior authorizations and step edits and all these things were really put into slow drug adoption. It sort of really started with a number of products, but you know, I always think of my Enbrel prior authorization process, which was like 20, 30 pages worth before you could get onto these high-priced biologic drugs at the time. That has just escalated to pretty much every class of drug that exists, and unfortunately even exists in my antibiotic, which is an acute drug.
Yeah, yeah.
When you're talking about acute products, you're literally saying, I'm going to delay the use of an acute product that in my case, in some cases, could be life-saving.
Yeah, yeah.
Which frankly is like practicing medicine without a license. Many of the people that make these decisions in these PBMs, and even in some cases in formularies, are not even medics, and they don't even understand the disease area that well, or the ramifications of this, because they do it because it's the way that they do it. You know, this is how we control drugs without actually thinking about the implications. But you know, every product that comes to market today is going to have a prior authorization. At the very least, they're going to have a quantity limit. They're going to have an indication, and it has to be on label. And no matter how cheap it is, unless it's at the price of a generic, that's going to be embedded. And we're going to see that for every product that comes to market from now on in. Obviously, there are some places where, if you're working specifically in in the institutions and the hospitals, they can sort of work with the payers to try and understand how, you know, they're going to get through these processes. But, you know, what's going to be needed and what's going to happen as a result is that we're going to find that many of the offices that we call on, whether they be primary care, whether they become specialty, they're going to have even more back office staff that are just dealing with prior authorizations. As it is today, there are whole companies that are built to just deal with prior authorizations, thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. And on the other side, you've got the actual PBMs that have got thousands of people just denying claims.
So they just get all this. Now, one question though is, do you see, you know, I mean, technology touches all sorts of parts of the economy and so forth, and then touching all sorts of the life science industry. Now, I personally don't see AI having a big impact on Salesforce, but are there any technologies, whatever it may be, you know, think broadly, that are coming into play that you think, if you're running a Salesforce for a biopharma company, that you have to think about?
Well, I'm not sure it exists today,
Mm-hmm.
but one of the biggest challenges for all representatives is their routing. You know, where do they go at what time and when,
Mm-hmm.
and can they get there? Now, if you think about Uber have a very sophisticated routing system that enables their drivers to get from point A to B as quickly as possible. If we could integrate that into a call route for a representative in terms of when they can see physicians and at what time, that would be really, really useful. Now, of course, it's very dependent on the data that's in there to be able to do that. So you have to have a pretty good idea of when doctors see and when they don't.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I'm not sure that that system is as accurate as it could be, but I could see AI helping there. I'm pretty sure that when it comes to, you know, characteristics of what makes a good prescriber, who's a good prospect, that there's groups that are working on that right now to try and understand, you know, a bit better. In the old days, we used to say it goes into a black box, and I'm sure there were all these algorithms running to determine what was the best characteristic. But nowadays, I'm pretty sure they probably find a way of throwing it into some artificial intelligence that spits out an answer and says, this particular individual, this doctor, and this doctor are targets. Don't ask the question why, but the AI has done that. Those are the areas where I think that we might see some AI. In terms of other technologies, I mean, I mentioned the ability to promote remotely. We did it during COVID. Where would we have been without Zoom? Where would we have been without WebEx? In those days, it was impossible. It would have been, telephone and nothing else. And we know that physicians learn as much visually as they do versus in the voice.
Yeah.
From a marketing perspective. So that technology, I think, is here to stay. We're conducting this meeting over WebEx, and the truth is that years ago we would never even have thought of doing this. Me coming to New York instead of being in the airport in Philadelphia. But the truth is that this is a wonderful use of technology, and there are certain times and places when this type of technology has become, the right one to use. I mean, I think of the number of advisory boards that we used to do all in person. There's still time and place for an in-person advisory board, but most of these things now are done via remote nature, and you get just as much out of them. So, we are definitely using technology to become more productive, and I'm pretty sure that there'll be some others that come along. On the field force side, certainly we use. I was just before I came here, I was chatting to my marketing manager about a challenge that I proposed to him, and he said, if we just use the iPad 100% of the time, because we use a mixture of paper and an iPad, and I was asking him about transitioning from one thing to the next, and it's two pieces. And he said, if it's actually all done on the iPad, there is no issue. It's really, really simple to do, as opposed to doing things in paper. Unfortunately, one of the things about having a field force is that some of them still like to use the paper. So we do.
Yeah, no, and you have to take into account human behavior.
Exactly.
By the way, one thing that is, I've spent a lot of time thinking about AI and where it works and doesn't work, and clearly one factor is it operating off of very good data, right?
Yes.
And you're finding where AI doesn't work really well is if the data is not relatively pristine and so forth. So for example, drug discovery, it works because the data is pristine because it's your data. Whereas
so long as you've not made it up, Peter.
Yeah, that's right. Now, and so actually, for example, the thing about routing, et cetera, I mean, if to the extent that you can have data that's pristine and accurate, you can do something. By the way, as a joke, I thought when you were saying, well, like with Uber and so forth, I thought you were going to say, oh, I'm getting all my salespeople to be part-time Uber drivers and part-time drug salespeople, and that the doctor can call and say, yeah, could you come? I'd like to learn about your antibiotic. And oh, by the way, could you also bring me a salad?
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean,
you can combine Uber Eats and, Salesforce. What do you think?
Yeah, you could try it. I mean, the truth is, you think about it though, they spend a lot of time behind the wheel, driving from one place to the next. And it's one thing. If I had a wish list, that would be one of the things I would love someone to come up with. But the challenge there is that the data that's not pristine. It's not the routing, because of course, they have access to cameras and they can see where there's traffic jams and all this sort of stuff. It's actually, when does the doctor optimally see, and has that been adequately and appropriately and accurately inputted into the system to say, Dr. Peter Young sees people on a Thursday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, so someone really has to keep that data and input it in.
It has to be accurate.
Otherwise the system is worthless, right?
Well, otherwise you're going to be turning up at calls and they're going to say the doctor's not even in on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, because I asked this question, and it's not there yet, but I'm absolutely sure someone's going to try and work out how to do it. I think that there's, I mentioned other data. I mean, I'm pretty sure, because we already do these things. We do all sorts of profitability analysis, and we look at things, for example, can you use samples? If you're allowed to use samples, is there a way to use AI to determine what the optimal number of samples are, not just the volume, but also when?
Yeah. Yeah.
and how many.
Yeah.
That would be a really sophisticated thing for us to try and tease out, but potentially we have the data because we know what's going on with these physicians, especially when you've got really good prescription data to be able to make that determination. So there are some places where I think, there are some places that if you think hard, you could see a use for an intelligence that can spit out an answer that really, really helps you become more efficient.
Yeah. Now, Adam, there's been a lot of structural change in the whole physician, industry, right? I mean, the days of the independent doctor, primary care doctor operating out of, it's getting tougher and tougher for them. And
Yep.
so many of them now are just employees of hospitals or groups or whatever and so forth.
Yeah.
Has that changed the nature of the sales and marketing part of the industry? Because now they're no longer their own, they're part
I
of the
will tell you,
place.
absolutely, Peter. There's one massive change that I've observed over the last few years. Um, Nurse practitioners have become a force to be reckoned with, and I'll tell you even why. One, as you're probably aware, it's the fastest growing profession in the medical arena at the moment. There's a lot of people coming straight out of high school that say they want to become a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. But nurse practitioners, and I'm going to focus on them in particular, they're eager for knowledge.
Yeah.
They take a patient-centric approach. They don't quite have the requirements imposed on them of a physician to see the same number of people at a speed that sometimes is not conducive to spending quality time with their patient that the physicians have.
Right.
Um, and here's the big thing. They're often willing to go back to bat with the payers to make sure they see through the prior authorization process for branded and newer medications if
Yeah.
they see the value in a
Yeah.
patient type. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. If anything, the focus on nurse practitioners has just increased, and I think it will
So
continue.
your salespeople, do they call on both the doctor and the nurse practitioners or?
So we when we did this is an interesting finding. We were looking at our data about a year and a half, 2 years into the primary care promotion, and we had right at the beginning we had a set of characteristics that we said would make a good prescriber. It was someone that had used a branded agent, had high volume of patients,
Yeah.
that normally would look for. And then what we did was we started to look at our prescribing database. In there, we found that about a third of the primary care doctors' offices, about a third of them were nurse practitioners that were actually coming up in our list of targets. Interestingly enough, our representatives didn't call on them a third of the time. They only called on them about 20% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
What was really fascinating was their productivity was higher than the primary care docs.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
So now what we do is we over-index nurse practitioners. And the reason we believe is because they're more willing to take the time to go through the prior authorization process for the branded agent. And the physicians, in many cases, they only refer it to the nurse practitioner anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
so it was an interesting observation. And again, I'm being pretty specific to primary care, which is not going to be pertinent to someone that's working in the hospital world. But it is definitely something that we've observed out there in the primary care setting. In the hospitals, what I would say to you is that, cost is a major drive of almost every decision in hospitals. They are really struggling. The DRG system does need to change at some point because there really isn't room in DRGs for a new branded agent in many cases,
Right.
especially not in the area I work in with anti-infectives, because there just hasn't been the innovation that there has been in some other areas. And the NTAP process is extraordinarily clunky and cumbersome for hospitals to deal with, which they have to deal with for certain oncology products and gene therapies and other things. But it's a clunky system, and there needs to be a change there. I don't know what the answer is to that, but we should get some good brains on it.
Yeah. Well, well, you're talking about primary because I prompted the question, so
Yep.
it's not your fault, but I'm glad you pivoted to how it looks in the hospital because obviously the decision making and the pressures at the hospital with regard to drugs is quite different for individual practices and so forth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, look, we're coming on the end of the hour, and this has been wonderful. Adam, I'm really pleased that you were a speaker here because we've been able to accomplish the kind of things that we want to, which is not only get the benefit of your experience, but also your big picture view of the industry and what does all mean. So we're going to end, and I'm going to ask you, for the people out there who are responsible for building sales forces and so forth, whatever, what would be the key takeaway that you want them to take away from this session as far as a learning or a piece of advice that you want them, to remember in order for them to be successful?
I would, if I could give one piece of advice to everyone, is don't build with the intention, with the belief that you've got to throw everything at it straight away.
Yeah.
Take your time, do a test and control if you can, some sort of form of pilot. If you need 100 representatives, maybe you start with 20 and see how it goes. And then when it comes to the payers, go there, take your time, and ensure that you don't get yourself into a position where you've given away so much in terms of your profitability that you can no longer become a profitable product or a company. But in the field force, definitely take it one step at a time. No one wants to believe they're going to be unsuccessful, but it's always worth checking before you jump in with both feet.
Yeah. And in this environment, which is going to be very difficult for some time, it puts a greater premium on exactly what you're saying, right?
Yeah, you
Because
can
you
learn.
you don't have funny money to play around with.
No, you don't, and you can learn from those initial individuals that are out in the field. They will teach you a great deal, and then your second wave will be your most successful wave because you will not be making the same mistakes that you made with that first group.
Yeah. Well, my father had a lot of good sayings, and which I've tried to follow. But one of his sayings was, if you want to be successful, first of all, you want to learn from people who've been successful and understand what they believe are the levers for success. But you also want to learn from the mistakes of other people. Because he said, you can put your hand in a flame and burn yourself, and you will learn that that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's a lot better if you see someone else put their hand in a flame and say, I don't think I'd want to do that. So, but I want to end by saying, as the audience obviously figured out, I have a great deal of respect for our speaker, Adam. And I think really two things. One, he's very, very good at what he does, and he's done it over and over again for a lot of very successful companies. But it's very unusual for someone to be able to take the big picture and be as effective in understanding the big picture as it is to understand their particular part of the world. And Adam has a very special talent to be able to do that. It's not true of very many people, by the way. Even if they're really good at what they do, and some of the big picture people, they can't, you tell them now, I'm going to arm you just to look at manufacturing or sales, and they struggle, right? So Adam is a rare combination, which which is why I wanted him to be, the speaker for this one. So I want to thank Adam for being the part of this fireside chat. I know you're running off to the airport, which I know you never do, right?
Not every day.
But also that this is recorded. It's going to be on our website, but also we're going to make it available to people so that they can binge watch, and I'll send it to Netflix in case they want to make it into a series.
Yeah. Good for them.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's a real pleasure.
No, thank you, Peter. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.